Chapter 1. The Earth and the Unity of Man. In the times following the Great Flood, when the bitter taste of universal sorrow had dissipated, and the cleansed and purified earth breathed with freshness, mankind, the descendants of Noah, journeyed eastward, seeking their new Eden. They found it on the plains of Shinar, boundless as the ocean. This was a promised land, not given from the heavens, but won by labor, where the fertile soil stretched out like a golden carpet, and the Tigris and Euphrates flowed as silver ribbons, reminders of the life-giving force that broke through death. The sun here didn't just rise, it ascended like a majestic king, its rays barely touching the horizon, promising endless day and inexhaustible harvest. But their greatest wealth, the priceless gift remaining from pre-sinful times, was their unity, absolute, crystalline, and unshakable. The people spoke one language, and this was more than just a common lexicon. It was one shared heart, one single breath, one pulsating thought that flowed from one person to another. When one pondered the shape of a brick, the second was already preparing the mortar, and the third envisioned the entire city. There were no misunderstandings, no disputes, no ambiguities. They were like a gigantic, perfectly tuned mechanism, created for accomplishments that transcend human comprehension. They worked together with a joy bordering on ecstasy. Their dwellings grew like mushrooms after rain. Their fields were cultivated with jewelry-like precision, and in the evenings, by the fire, they told stories of righteous Noah, of the ark that sailed over mountaintops, and of the terrible judgment they barely survived. The memory of the flood was their shared reminder of the formidable might of the Creator, but over time, this memory began to fade, turning into a legend that only highlighted their own ingenuity and capacity for survival. And so, one day, when the soft murmur of the Euphrates seemed too quiet against the background of their grand dreams, and the stars in the night sky, too distant and indifferent, this dream of greatness escalated into a daring, dangerous ambition. A question, which sounded like a challenge, hung in the air. If we were able to survive God's wrath, is there a limit to our own power? The answer came in the form of a collective, frantic enlightenment that pierced thousands of hearts simultaneously. The shout rang out like an explosion that cast off the last burden of fear of the past from their souls. Let us build ourselves a city and a tower, whose top may reach into the heavens. This idea became their shared mad project, their new secular religion. The tower was meant to be more than just a structure. It was to be a materialized symbol of man's absolute power over earthly destiny. It was to be an anchor, holding them forever from scattering across the earth, which, as they knew from Noah's covenants, was God's will. This was an act of refusal to fulfill the divine command to fill the earth. Human pride, which had slept after the flood, awakened. It was not mere vanity, but a grandiose messianic complex. They wanted to create a fallback plan in case of a new flood, and most importantly, to make a name for themselves. This name was synonymous with eternal glory, a monument that would surpass the Creator himself. Their hearts burned with these ambitions. It was like a fever that gripped the entire nation. They no longer looked at the heavens with reverence. They looked at them as the highest, yet attainable step. On this fertile plain of Shinar, under the golden rays of the generous sun, they began planning a construction that was to be the ultimate challenge thrown at heaven. Chapter 2. The beginning of construction. The plains of Shinar came alive and buzzed, transforming into an epic, frantic hive. This was no longer the calm, rhythmic life of farmers. It was a fierce, passionate, obsessed labor marathon. The tower became the center of their universe, the axis around which all existence revolved. They abandoned ordinary stone, realizing that this grand project required a stronger, more symbolic material. And so, crowds of workers took up brickmaking, transforming the soft clay of Shinar into hard, fired blocks that symbolized the unshakable nature of their will. These bricks, bound with natural bituminous pitch, black and sticky as original sin, became stronger than any stone, perfectly suited for a monument that was meant to stand forever. The soundscape of the construction was truly unearthly. Thousands of hammers struck in unison. Millions of bricks fell onto mortar with a monotonous plop, and the grinding and rumbling of the hauling mechanisms, invented specifically for this project, never ceased day or night. All these sounds merged into a single, mighty hymn to human ingenuity and self-affirmation. People no longer slept long. Their rest was short, interrupted, because the spirit of ambition gave them no peace. Even in their sleep, they seemed to feel how their creation continued to grow, pulling their souls upward. The workers, organized with incredible, almost military precision, worked in shifts. They lifted stones and carried heavy beams, their faces covered in dust and pitch, transforming them into epic, dirty titans. The roofs of the houses below unfolded like carpets, and the tower grew like a living stone organism that constantly consumed resources and human energy, but repaid them with dizzying height. It soared into the sky, layer by layer, level by level, and soon its lower tiers were lost in a misty haze, while the builders on the upper levels saw the earth only as a small, distant spot. As the higher the tower grew, the deeper and darker the crack in the collective heart became. Among the builders, who started as one people, were those whose hearts were filled with a craving for power, glory, and eternal memory. They no longer thought of we, but of I. Everyone wanted their name to be carved in stone, for their destiny to be forever intertwined with this monument. It was a fierce competition for a place under the sun, or rather, for a place as close to the sun as possible. Ideals and ambitions intertwined with anxiety. Would the tower not collapse under the weight of human pride? This pride was heavier than any brick block. A terrible cruelty also appeared. If a brick fell while lifting a heavy load, it was considered regrettable but mundane. But if a worker fell from a height, it was barely noticed. Human life became cheaper than a well-fired brick, because a brick was harder to make and deliver to the top. The tower devoured lives, but no one stopped. The inevitability with which their greatness grew dulled the sense of fear and respect for life. Everyone was obsessed with one goal: to reach heaven, to prove to themselves and the world that they themselves were the pinnacle of creation. They, just saved from the water, were now challenging the very source of their salvation, building their tower on the foundation of pride and forgetfulness. Chapter 3. Heaven is near, the heart is far from God. The tower approached its climax, piercing not only the clouds, but also the very consciousness of the builders. Every meter that separated them from the ground was a step towards a psychological transformation, filled with deceptive grandeur. People, standing at these dangerous, dizzying heights, lifted their eyes to the sky and felt that the top was not just touching, but seemingly penetrating the cloud cover. They breathed the rarefied air, and this caused not altitude sickness, but bouts of intellectual and spiritual mania. The earth below became a toy-like, insignificant world, where only those who lacked the courage or intellect to ascend scurried about. It was there, at the height where the voice of the wind drowned out the voice of conscience, that dangerous heretical whispers began to sound among them, quickly escalating into loud, convinced speeches. "We ourselves shall become gods. We will create a new order." This was no longer construction for safety. It became construction for usurpation. They dreamed that when a new flood came, they would not merely survive, but would ascend to the summit to cast God's own fiery water back in his face, proving their complete self-sufficiency. Pride blinded their hearts like the scorching, unfamiliar sun. They forgot that it was He, the Lord, who saved their ancestor, that it was His mercy that allowed them to resettle the earth. Gratitude faded, turning into a feeling of resentment that someone could be above them at all. Their voices filled the air, merging into praise for their own abilities, their own engineering thought, their own unity, and not for the Lord. On every new tier, they did not erect altars. They erected marble plaques with their names, glorifying the genius of humanity. The tower became a gigantic, solidified prayer wheel that carried the mantra of self-deification to the heavens. They looked down at their hands and saw in them divine power, not a gift. They felt that they themselves were the law, the source, the alpha, and the omega of their new world. Their hearts turned away from God by thousands of kilometers, although physically they approached his heavens by only dozens of meters. This contrast was terrifying. Their spiritual eyes were blinded by the illusion of achievement. The builders above considered themselves a new aristocracy of the spirit, detached from the sinful, lowly earth. They began to create rules that contradicted all divine covenants. Their morality became as flexible and unstable as the wind on the tower's summit. They were already planning how from this celestial fortress they would rule the world left below, establishing their own merciless laws. Their pursuit of greatness turned into a true spiritual oncology that threatened not only them, but all future generations. They were more dangerous than the pre-flood sinners, because the latter sinned in ignorance, while these sinned knowingly and brazenly, with the testimony of God's judgment in their memory. Chapter 4. Punishment and the confusion of tongues. The silence in the heavens was deceptive. The Lord did not need the roar of thunder or flashes of lightning to take notice of human pride. He looked upon this frenzied construction from the height of incomprehensible love and painful justice. His eyes, which saw not only brick and pitch, but also the dark, hardened thoughts in the depths of every soul, were like fire, filled with sorrow and bitterness. Sorrow that his creation, barely saved, had returned to the path of self-destruction, and justice, which demanded intervention to stop this spiritual suicide, this epidemic of pride, before it became irreversible. Behold, they are one people, and their plans are proud. Their hearts are turned away from me. The voice echoed in the heavenly chambers. This is only the beginning of their intentions. Henceforth, they will know no obstacle in their self-deification. I must come down so that they do not achieve such unity in evil that would be dangerous to their very existence. It was an act of mercy disguised as judgment. a surgical operation to save the human soul from its own tyranny. And then the Lord descended. But he did not destroy the tower with fire. His coming was not physical, but metaphysical, touching the very fabric of human communication. Suddenly, at the height of their labor, in the very midst of the builder's unified hymn, something broke. The sky did not crack, but the language cracked. It was a terrible, instantaneous feeling, as if a short, painful flash occurred in everyone's brain, interrupting all logical chains. The words that were once crystallinely pure unity turned into chaos. When the foreman shouted, "Hand me the pitch," his assistant heard, "Shout at the owl," or "Break your leg." The sounds were familiar, but the meaning, alien, hostile, incomprehensible. It was a painful cacophony that killed not the body, but the mind and soul. People began to shout, not out of anger, but out of pure, desperate bewilderment. They looked at each other's faces, searching for answers, but saw there only the reflection of their own terror. Panic erupted on the tower. Workers who could not understand the command to change the load began to argue, and their voices, which once merged into a song, now diverged into wild, unintelligible quarrels. Stones fell, not from a divine strike, but destroyed by misunderstood orders and the loss of coordination. Someone let go of the rope, someone pulled it too hard, and now the first victims of this linguistic catastrophe plummeted, crashing against the tower's base. This was a punishment that required no physical force, only a touch to the very root of human pride, to their unity, their shared thought. God confused their tongues, and words, meant to be bridges, turned into impassable walls, erected within their own souls. Chapter 5. Dispersion and the end of the Great Tower. The chaos that erupted on the tower quickly descended upon the city they had so painstakingly built to remain united forever. It was the dawn of sorrowful dispersion. A chaotic, multilingual uproar reigned on the construction site, where those whose ears still recognized familiar phonemes desperately tried to find each other. Families, clans, teams, everything fell apart, crumbling like dried brick. The deepest tragedy lay in the fact that no one could understand why his closest friend, brother, or son suddenly started speaking nonsense. It was like madness that gripped an entire nation. People, having lost unity, could no longer cooperate. Any attempt to continue construction resulted in new accidents and tragicomic misunderstandings. The tower, which was supposed to be their eternal symbol and refuge, turned into a gigantic, silent, unfinished threat, a monument to their collective shame. It stood like a fragment, piercing the sky but not reaching it, and its incompleteness was the loudest reproach possible. And the dispersion began, painful, forced, irreversible. Groups whose languages, although mixed from the original one, retained some similarity, began to move away from each other. They went north, south, west, carrying with them not only the seeds of new life, but also the heavy burden of misunderstanding that became their eternal curse. Their parting glances were filled not with malice, but with boundless sorrow over the loss of a shared soul. People who had been a single nation just yesterday became strangers, forced to relearn to trust and negotiate. At the site of their city, which they proudly named Babel, the place of confusion, only ruins remained. Huge fired bricks, mixed with thick pitch, lay scattered across the plain, as if toys thrown by an angry child. The ruins of the Tower of Babel stood as an eternal, masterly reminder of the pride of humanity. It was not just broken, it was decomposed into the constituent parts that were languages. Dispersion became the bitter, yet necessary beginning of new nations, languages, and cultures that subsequently filled the earth. Every new language, every new dialect was a fragment of that single, original language that shattered against the rock of human self-adoration. But the memory of unity, of those times when the word was not an obstacle, but pure truth, remained. People will never forget that the desire to exalt oneself above God inevitably turns into ruin and confusion. And every stone that did not find its place in the unfinished tower silently tells this epic, sacred story of pride and its irreversible, universal consequences, which still echo in every dispute and every misunderstanding between nations.